Hey, this is Tony Jones for thehardestquestion.org, and it is Ordinary Week 29. Although, as Russell Rathbun has shown us again here on The Hardest Question, there's nothing particularly ordinary about this week's texts. The Gospel, I think, is a particularly odd little text. But that's actually not the one I'm going to focus on this week. I'm going to focus on Russell's reading of Psalm 119. He starts out with, I guess, what we would all say is the most noteworthy aspect of this psalm, and that how incredibly long it is. Longest psalm, longest chapter of the whole Bible, kind of goes on and on. Makes me wonder, actually, why those... the lectionaries, as he calls them, those wise and faithful men and women who put together the Revised Common Lectionary, how they cut out other parts of shorter psalms, but leave in this entire psalm. Because, I mean, even for reading it in public worship, it would take a significantly long time and a big part of your average, 55-minute mainline Protestant worship service. So it'd be interesting to me to hear from some of you in the THQ community if you really are going to preach on Psalm 119, and if you really would use the entire psalm in your public worship service. But that aside, that's not really the hardest question. Russell's hardest question is, I think, probably the hardest question that Russell has asked yet in the history of our website. He basically asks if the psalmist is sincere. Russell admits to his struggle to think that you put your reverence for the law in the same line as something you're longing for. So he writes, the phrase longing for your ordinances is a hard one for me to swallow unless it's a euphemism for something else. It's difficult for me to see how longing and ordinances ever make it into the same sentence. An ordinance is something issued by the Parks Department to keep people from dumping their garbage in the woods. It's not an object of desire. Well, this entire psalm is an ode of longing for and in honor of, a paean to Torah, the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. And Russell is honest about his struggle with that psalm and with singing a psalm of praise to ordinances and laws. I mean, how many of us sit around and sing praises to the book of Leviticus or the book of Numbers, these books that list out hundreds and hundreds of laws that are still debated in this day, as the people who argue for or against same-sex marriage in the church, and there are then satirical websites about not eating shrimp because that is also forbidden in the Levitical law. And yet here we run into this psalm that's part of the lectionary for us to struggle with how to preach it, and it's an ode of joy and longing for the laws. But my question for Russell, and my question for those of you in the THQ reading community and preaching community, is: can you really preach a sermon that questions the sincerity of the psalmist or of any biblical writer? Because Russell goes on to ask, well, maybe the psalmist is going overboard a bit. Maybe the psalmist is not totally sincere in his longing for the righteous ordinances of the Lord. And I don't know that I've ever heard a preacher actually tackle that question. And I just think it's a fascinating one. I think it would be a fascinating challenge to try to preach that in a way that's sensitive to a congregation what a congregation thinks about the Bible and the biblical writers. It would definitely humanize the biblical writers, maybe to the point of a lot of discomfort among a congregation who isn't usually in the position of questioning the sincerity of the biblical writers. Or maybe it's just hard for Russell to sincerely preach a sermon longing for the laws and ordinances of God that are recorded in the first 5 books of the Bible. Anyways, I think it's a fascinating post. I don't have a great answer for it, but it may be the hardest question about Psalm 119.